Good morning. Thank you all for being here. We have Mayor Marion Baldwin, followed by Police Chief Cassandra Deck-Brown. We are also joined by several members of our City Council as well as our City Manager, Ruffin Hall. So first you will hear from Mayor Marion Baldwin, followed by the Police Chief, and then we are open for questions. Mayor.
Thank you everybody for being here. Good morning. Last night was both heartbreaking and devastating. In all my years, I've never quite seen anything like this. What took place were two very different experiences. One, hundreds of people coming together in the late afternoon to have their voices heard in peaceful and respectful ways. It was the way protests in our city have always happened. Second, there's a group of people who came in the dark of night who had no intention of protesting peacefully. Instead, their goal was destruction, theft, and violence, as you can see in our streets today. For those who want to protest peacefully, Raleigh will always be a place where differing voices can be shared and citizens will be allowed to protest within the law. For the second group, you are not Raleigh. Your actions are not welcome and will not be tolerated. As the state's capital, we have had a long history of working together with the community to allow for peaceful protest, marches, and movements. For years, our police department and public officials have worked closely with community leaders to ensure safe space for everyone's voices to be heard. Last night wasn't about building bridges, unfortunately. It was about burning bridges. So now, beginning today, we begin the slow process of rebuilding, repairing, and putting the pieces back together. While windows can be replaced and graffiti can be removed, the real work is with the community. That's all of us. We must continue to come together without the threat of violence if we truly want to find common ground. And one of the things that, even though today is terrible, one of the things that has made me feel good, see all the people down here helping each other, cleaning up, sweeping, boarding up, protecting each other, coming together. That is Raleigh, and that's the spirit we want to harness. I've also contacted Governor Cooper and asked him for support. Additionally, we are calling for a state of emergency, which will allow us the option of calling for a curfew if needed. We're taking these drastic steps because we will not allow fear to rule our community. We are Raleigh. We have been through so much, all the world has since March. First a pandemic, now this. I'm asking all of you to please come together in peace and help us begin the rebuilding process. I would now like to ask Police Chief Deck-Brown to come forward and say a few words, and then we'll take questions. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. The actions of the violent, lawless crowd that damaged our city and attacked officers and assaulted officers last night was disgusting and unacceptable. These actions tarnished the message of those who peacefully demonstrated and assembled earlier that day. Here you can act together. People came out in order to honor those who lost their lives. And this event came to an end where those names, however they died, were desecrated in every way imaginable through the crime that was committed, the looting that occurred, the assaults that happened, and the sheer vandalism that took place in this city. Raleigh police officers, along with numerous officers from other agencies, they responded here in our city to assist. Those officers collectively behaved valiantly under unprecedented circumstances and showed tremendous restraint and professionalism. While the damage to our city was significant, the actions of these brave officers prevented more extensive and widespread damage. 5 officers were transported to the hospital last night due to injuries sustained. I am happy to say that they all went home and were released from the hospital as well. And I want to take a moment to simply thank the many jurisdictions who came out to assist us in this crisis. And not only did those chiefs send personnel, but they sent assets as well. The Apex Police Department, the Cary Police Department, the Clayton Police Department, Garner PD, Fuquay-Varina Police Department, the Johnston County Sheriff's Office, the Wake County Sheriff's Office, and the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. But let me be clear about this. The Raleigh Police Department helped to facilitate the peaceful protest and the gathering that occurred before some members of the crowd became violent and destructive. It was not until after the crowd began to throw bottles and rocks at officers that the Raleigh Police Department escalated their response. And while I hear and I understand the frustration felt by many in our community and throughout the country, destroying our city is not the answer. Destroying our city will never be the answer. And destroying our city is not acceptable, and it will not be tolerated. The Raleigh Police Department has already begun investigating the numerous crimes that occurred last night, and we will continue to work tirelessly to identify and prosecute those who made the choice to behave in such a lawless manner. With 12 arrests made overnight, there will be more to follow. This is our city. This is the capital city. And it's not just about law enforcement, but as a community, it is incumbent upon each of us to develop an intolerance for this kind of mayhem. The police department did not sit back and just allow crime to happen. People showed up with an agenda and a purpose, and it was to bring this damage and this vandalism and this destruction to the city of Raleigh, to our home. For those who want to be heard, do not let those who seek to sow seeds of anarchy lead you down a path of violence and destruction. You're stronger than that. We are stronger than that. You're better than that. And we are better than that. And when you talk about community, it wasn't community that came out yesterday. Community is in place right now, cleaning up the sidewalks. And helping to rebuild our community. The mayor talked about bridges. We have to be a community of building bridges. We cannot be one that burns them. And fires happened all over this city last night. Please look around. This is what community is and should be like. This is our community. Thank you.
We're now taking questions from the press, yes.
So I think there's a significant fraction of Black America that would say this is the kind of violence that they experience every day. And peaceful protests have not gotten them far enough over the past 400 or even 10 years. How would you respond to that?
think you're right in some ways. Law enforcement has not had an untarnished history. And we as law enforcement officers have to recognize that. But when some situations happen, and I can tell you from my Raleigh police officers, we don't sign up to have to shoot anybody. We don't sign up to take a life. But we know in reality those things happen. But I think as a community, we also have to begin to talk about what gets us there. How do we get there? Where there's a confrontation, where lives are lost, where property is damaged. But we also have to own that word accountability, and it's on both sides of that coin. And protest, when they end like this, where's the accountability? And I think we have to ask and be truthful in all of those questions. But it has to be more about doing and not just the actions also.
I'm going to follow up to that. You know, with all of this, what we can't forget is the cause. What happened and why people were out here. That's what we have to remember going forward. How are we going to bring our community together? How are we going to deal with systemic racism? How are we going to have a community conversation so we do better? And that was the hope of the peaceful protest. Unfortunately, we're dealing with what we're dealing with, but we will not forget the cause and the purpose.
Well, so then let me ask you, how are we going to do that?
Well, first, City Council is going, this happened to be on our agenda on Tuesday. We are hiring consultants to help us with racial equity training. That's number one. They will help lead a community conversation on that. So we think that's really important first step, because this really is about bringing the community together and having that conversation. And that's the intention. Step number one.
Questions?
Well, Chief and Mayor, where were you last night? I don't think the community heard from you until about 4 hours ago.
Just because you didn't see me out here doesn't mean that my work and my effort as the leader of the Raleigh Police Department was not present in many ways. Those other agencies that arrived to assist us, the assessment of the ongoing situations. And I can tell you, we had about 2 hours of peaceful protest or rallying, and everything after that was anarchy. The chief has to be the leader as well. And whether you see me here or other places, you can best believe that I am working to make sure that the best interest for this city and the men and women who wear this uniform and all of those who responded to assist us is hard at work.
Did you expect to see the destruction that you saw last night?
Of course not. No one expected to see this destruction. But we always do our best to prepare for the possible worst. And you know, when you look at last week, there were several tragic events. And at the top of that list was the death of Mr. Floyd. But there were several other situations that really just sort of began to heat up that situation. On top of people being closed in for so many months at a time, all of that creates a powder keg, if you will, and that pressure showed up here. But that's not how you memorialize anyone, and we have to recognize that as well. When you talk about systemic racism, there were several incidents, including an incident that happened in a park in New York that was nothing but systemic racism. So when we look in the mirror and we talk about racism, it's not just the law enforcement side of it. It's embodied in the greater community, and we all have to own that as well.
A lot of the local businesses down here feel like police didn't do enough to protect them last night. How can they feel safe having a business downtown?
The people in this community know the Raleigh Police Department also. And the businesses aligning these streets know the Raleigh Police Department well. When the greater risk is of injury to the officer, and I had 5 injured last night. A building, a window, a door, the property within it can easily be replaced. But for a person who's had officers shot, and more recently than not, I will not put an officer in harm's way to protect the property inside of a building, because insurance is most likely going to cover that as well. But that officer's safety is the utmost importance. And when you have more people on the ground than you have officers, we've got to be wise and strategic as to how we deploy them at that time. But there were situations where officers did take action. But if you look closely enough at your footage, you also saw where that community showed up and rallied around our officers, circled our officers, and threatened them, and threw rocks at them, and did everything they could do to harm them. And some of the rocks that you saw were small, but they threw them at them. But my officers got hit with stones last night and pavers.
Can you tell us about some of the injuries of the officers? Were they just from the rocks?
We have brain bruise. We have broken teeth. We have damage to a jaw. I'm not sure what the extent of that injury is just yet. We had someone with cardiac issues, and the list goes on.
What was your strategy? And what did you tell in approaching this protest? And what were the instructions to officers on when to use crowd control tools like gas, rubber bullets, pepper spray?
When it is no longer peaceful, and let me be clear, First Amendment allows people to say what they want, do what they want, to the extent that they're not violating the law. But when you start assaulting individuals out there, we have no choice but to escalate on that situation, to render the overall situation safe for others. And there were a lot of people out there who had absolute good intentions, but there were some who showed up for the only purpose of causing what you see here.
Did you have a strategy walking into the night?
Of course we had a strategy, and if you know much about the police department, we don't go into a lot of detail in terms of the tactics, but there was a plan, and there was communication with the individuals who put this together.
And was there any discussion about bringing in the National Guard?
There's a process to bring in the National Guard, so you can't just bring in the National Guard. So last night, no, there was no conversation in the middle of this about bringing in the National Guard to show up right here in the middle of the crisis. There are steps in a process that happens.
And are there any investigations?
What are next steps? What are next steps moving forward after this past night? What are next steps for tonight moving forward? What do you plan on doing to protect the residents, businesses? That's what people are asking.
Speak to the people. We can't hear you.
Yeah, nobody can hear you out here.
We will continue to plan for these events accordingly. And that includes recognizing our resources and our assets when we are working through these events. We always make an effort to try and communicate with the individual who's coordinating these efforts as well. Sometimes they communicate back with us and sometimes they don't. But given the tone, given the national climate, given the things that had happened in the past week, we have to bring the necessary resources to bear, those resources that we have at that particular point in time. But the partnerships that we have throughout the county and beyond afford us to recognize what other resources are available and where we can seek them for further assistance.
Yes, ma'am.
Civilians were injured, and my second question is, did you know about a stolen RV for Raleigh Police Force and white supremacists at Raleigh last night?
Did I know about a what?
Apparently there was a stolen Raleigh police.
No, there wasn't.
Okay, and did you know if there was any white supremacist activity last night?
You can't look at a white supremacist and tell who they are. However,
By checking their background, you can. And a lot of y'all don't check them backgrounds over.
with 1,000 people out here attending this event, it's hard to know who's in that crowd. However, We are very watchful and we're very mindful. We did not have a horse stolen. There were horses here, but they were not the Raleigh Police Department's horses. And anytime we recognize the threat to our communities, we address those, and we address those in a timely manner. And we will continue to do that. As I mentioned in the speech itself, this investigation is ongoing. And I have no doubt that there will be others based on the actions they took, that we will be able to bring charges to bear.
What are you actively doing to bridge the gap between police and civilians, especially black civilians?
I am in this community a lot, as are our officers, and building those relationships are a constant effort for us. And recognizing the needs of our community and how we build on that is a constant as well. But there's a way to present those issues to the police chief or anybody else. This is not it. It's not it.
Where were you yesterday when the sheriff was down here? You do a lot of talking, but the way I look at it is, I'm from Wilson. Our police officers do not do us like here. And I had to get a couple of your officers straight and let them know I'm not from no Raleigh. I'm not going to play. You're not going to follow me and harass me. I let them know that a couple of them already know me.
Any other questions from the media,
I'm not
please?
going to go
Yes,
through
please.
I meant what I said.
They were from within our city, and some were from out of state. Can you repeat that?
Were civilians injured? Do you know the number on that?
There were civilians injured throughout. We had an individual shot down here last night as well. The threats, there were shots fired. That's not a peaceful rally. It's never going to be a peaceful rally. And your law enforcement agency is going to take actions when those efforts happen.
So one more question from the media. Thank you.
I spoke to Chief Davis yesterday about the fact that many Americans have lost faith in the police in this country. What do you want to say to those who may have lost faith even here in Raleigh in your department, and how can we get that back?
I think first of all, it's important to recognize that while I wear this uniform, I'm a black woman in America. I get what it's like to be black in more ways than many of you will ever imagine or know. So with that being said, what I can't forget either is, and I mentioned it several questions ago, the history of policing has not always been a polished career. And so we have to recognize the history of policing. And my officers have heard that training. I'm the one who teaches it. We've talked about the history of policing in the 1830s. We've talked about slave patrol. And while everything doesn't happen here in America, we have to also recognize that in Germany, in the 1930s, it was the police that created one of the greatest travesties in the world, the Holocaust. And so you build that history over time to Mr. Floyd, and it's very tarnished. And collectively, we do have to work to build that. We do have to work to build that, and we have to recognize that when actions aren't right, we have to address those as well, and we do.
Will there be a review?
Last question, please. Last question, right here.
I just want to, could you speak specifically in terms of what was the particular trigger, where and when in the city when you guys had to respond with the tear gas?
Yes, sir. The peaceful protest or the assembly lasted for about 2 hours and a few minutes. At some point, the walkers in that group decided to leave the area in front of the courthouse steps. And when they did, they went down the street, down Davies Street, to the Wake County Sheriff's Public Safety Building. When they got on McDowell Street, and you'll see from your footage, when they got on McDowell Street, they charged into the sally port of the Wake County Sheriff's Office, into that deck off of McDowell Street. And when they got up there, they were met with the tactical team from the Sheriff's Office. They were forcing their way in. and they deployed gas. When they were able to push them far enough down the Sally Port, the ramp, they got into the street, and you all have seen this. They continued to move forward. Interestingly enough, there were people out there who were telling them to push back in that crowd as well, telling the protesters to stay away from that building, and people kept going. The Raleigh Police Department deployed smoke initially, with the hopes that we could get our officers who were on the other side of that Sally Port out safely. Those officers did not have tactical gear on because they were providing safe perimeter for those who were walking in the protest. And when all of that happened, they went over to the other side of the Sally Port and were basically barricaded, for lack of a better way of putting it. So when the smoke did not benefit anyone and they didn't move back, then we deployed our tactical unit with gas, because we had to get those officers to safety.
Folks, thank you very much. Both the chief and the mayor are very busy to get back to work, as well as all the construction. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Chief Brown.